Since the dawn of humanity, when the first human gazed silently at the night sky, a question has echoed through civilizations, cultures, and centuries like a persistent whisper in the soul. What is consciousness? That which thinks, feels, observes, that hidden I that seems to dwell behind the eyes, continuing even when everything else is silent. Is it merely a spark produced by electrical impulses within a biological brain? Or are we facing something infinitely deeper, a spark of the universe itself, an expression of the infinite daring to perceive itself? Philosophically, this question reaches back to ancient Greece, where Plato spoke of the immortal soul imprisoned in a physical body, and Socrates urged us to know ourselves as a path to understanding the whole. Centuries later, René Descartes, by declaring, "I think, therefore I am," not only laid the foundation of modern rationalism, but also firmly separated the mind from the body, a notion known as dualism. Since then, science has sought to determine whether consciousness is a mere brain function or something that transcends the limits of the physical body. And the more we advance, the more this mystery seems to slip through the cracks of reason. To some neuroscientists, consciousness is an emergent property of billions of neurons interacting, a side effect of the brain's immense complexity. According to this materialist view, when the brain shuts down, consciousness simply ceases to exist, like a candle flame extinguished when the wax runs out. Yet this explanation seems to oversimplify something that, in human experience, is as vast as it is ineffable. After all, why do we feel what we feel? How do we explain love, pain, intuition, self-awareness? The very act of realizing that we exist is, in itself, a miracle that defies all known laws of physics. Alongside this view arise bolder theories, like the idea that the brain doesn't create consciousness, but rather receives it, like a radio tuning into an invisible frequency. This receiver brain theory suggests that consciousness is a fundamental field of the universe, present in everything, and that living organisms simply translate it into subjective experiences. This could explain why, in altered states of consciousness, such as deep meditation, near-death experiences, or the use of psychoactive substances, people often describe a perceptual expansion beyond the body, beyond time, beyond identity itself. But perhaps we are still approaching consciousness with tools far too primitive. The so-called hard problem of consciousness, as named by philosopher David Chalmers, is precisely this. Why do we feel what we feel? How does raw matter give rise to subjective experience? We can map the brain, stimulate regions with electricity, even predict behavioral responses. But no machine, however precise, can tell us what it feels like to be alive from within, to remember a lost love, to fear death, or to contemplate the infinite. There is also the mystery of different layers of consciousness. Is being awake the same as being conscious? And what about dreams, where we live entire experiences with their own logic? Or comas, trances, vegetative states? Some report lucid experiences even in irreversible clinical conditions. And in deep meditation, Tibetan monks describe states of pure light and unity with the universe, a consciousness expanding beyond body, ego, and physical reality. Throughout history, some cultures have regarded consciousness as sacred, untouchable, immortal. Others saw it as a fleeting phenomenon, a momentary spark, but all, without exception, were captivated by the silent enigma it presents. And the more we study it, the more we understand that perhaps consciousness is not an object to be analyzed, but the very background of all reality, the stage upon which everything unfolds, where time and space are but scenery. Thus, when we ask what happens to consciousness after death, we are not merely questioning the mystery of death, but the mystery of life itself, because only those who are conscious now wonder about the end. And it is in this now, this living instant, that the greatest question of all resides. What, after all, is this presence that hears me now, that feels, that thinks, that observes? And when this body falls silent, will it also fall silent? If there is one science that has come closest to touching the veil between life and death, it is neuroscience. The study of the human brain is at once a dive into the familiar and a journey into the unknown. After all, what happens in our minds during the final moments of life? Where does that feeling of "I am" go? Is there a clear boundary between the thinking brain and the absolute silence of death? Or does something continue to vibrate, even when everything seems to have ended? In recent years, advanced technologies like EEG and functional magnetic resonance imaging have allowed scientists to map, in real time, the final brain waves of terminal patients. In many of these cases, something extraordinary has been observed. Just seconds after cardiac arrest, the brain still displays intense and unexpected activity, as if, at the moment of death, it ignites one last time in a burst of energy and awareness, a strong, synchronized electrical pattern, often more orderly than during ordinary wakefulness. These phenomena have been called post-cardiac arrest neural coherence surges. In other words, even after the heart stops, the brain seems to activate a final sequence, almost as if it is trying to process everything it lived, to let go, or to cross a threshold we do not yet understand. This final burst, also observed in rodents and primates, raises a profound question. Are we witnessing a biological shutdown process, or the final manifestation of consciousness trying to break free from the body? During near-death states, some people report leaving their bodies, seeing the hospital room from above, hearing conversations among doctors, and describing details they could not have perceived clinically. In several studies, such as the AWARE project at the University of Southampton, researchers attempted to test these claims using hidden targets placed out of patients' view. Few results were conclusive, but the reports continue to challenge logic, especially when accompanied by flat ECGs, indicating no measurable brain activity at the time of the experience. Yet neuroscience, powerful as it is, still faces immense barriers. The brain is the most complex object in the known universe. Every thought involves billions of connections, synapses, and simultaneous patterns. We still do not fully understand how the brain generates or translates consciousness. Some theorists, like Giulio Tononi, have developed proposals such as integrated information theory, IIT, suggesting that consciousness arises from the brain's ability to integrate complex data in real time. Others, like Christoph Koch, seek specific regions in the brain that might act as the core of consciousness. But none has yet discovered a definitive formula. And what if we are asking the wrong question? What if consciousness is not inside the brain, but rather expressing itself through it? Just as the beam of a flashlight reveals what's in front of it, without being created by the wall it shines upon, perhaps the brain is merely the projector, not the source. This hypothesis, while unproven, is increasingly discussed in neuroscience and philosophy of mind circles, especially in light of cases that defy classical medical logic, patients with severely damaged brains who still display full consciousness or even heightened perception. And then come the big questions. When exactly does a person die? When the heart stops? When brain flow ceases? Or is there a mysterious interval, a few seconds, maybe minutes, in which consciousness still lingers, floating on a threshold between realities? In that space between the last breath and total silence, time seems to stretch. And perhaps, in that brief window, lies one of the greatest experiences of existence. Science continues to advance. Laboratories around the world are studying what happens to the mind in extreme states. Experiments with induced comas, sensory deprivation, and even clinical death simulations are being conducted. But there remains an ethical, practical, and philosophical boundary that prevents a definitive answer. Because no matter how thoroughly we map the brain's impulses, one mystery endures. Why do they generate this I that feels, thinks, and contemplates its own end? If neuroscience is the flashlight that illuminates the brain, consciousness is the abyss that still resists its light. And in observing the final flashes of a dying brain, perhaps we are only brushing the edges of a much greater universe, one where consciousness does not end, but transforms. Imagine yourself at the edge. Your body doesn't respond. The heart stops. According to the machines, the brain no longer shows signs of activity. And yet, you're still there, feeling, seeing, floating above the room, watching doctors try to resuscitate your body. hearing conversations that you will later describe in astonishing detail, and then a light, a tunnel, an indescribable sense of peace, as if you were returning home, even though you've never been there before. This is the essence of what thousands of people around the world report after what we call a near-death experience, or simply NDE. NDEs are perhaps the most intriguing phenomenon in the science of consciousness. They occur in extreme situations: cardiac arrests, fatal accidents, drownings, deep comas, and yet, when everything indicates the imminent end of life, something awakens, a new lucidity, a heightened state of awareness, vivid, often more real than reality itself. For those who experience it, there is no doubt. Death was crossed, but consciousness remained. These accounts come from all over the world, from people of different religions, ages, and cultures. And surprisingly, the elements described are largely similar. The sensation of floating above one's body, the feeling of passing through a tunnel toward a bright and welcoming light, the presence of deceased loved ones, a life review in rapid and profound flashes, a sense of unity with everything, and finally, the choice, or the command, to return, often against their own will. Skeptics argue that NDEs are the result of a collapsing brain, releasing substances such as dimethyltryptamine, DMT, in its final moments. For them, it's a biochemical hallucination, a final delusion produced by a dying organism. But this explanation runs into a disturbing paradox. How can we account for reports of conscious perception when the brain shows no electrical activity? How can we explain the accurate descriptions of conversations, instruments used, hidden object positions, all recounted by individuals who were clinically dead? The AWARE project, led by Dr. Sam Parnia, was one of the largest scientific efforts to investigate this. By placing images in locations only visible from the ceilings of emergency rooms, researchers aimed to verify whether cardiac arrest patients could, in fact, leave their bodies and perceive the environment. The results were mixed, but they opened the door to a deeper reflection. Could consciousness truly detach from the physical body? Other researchers, like Raymond Moody, author of the classic Life After Life, have spent decades studying thousands of NDE cases. According to him, the number of coincidences in these reports exceeds what chance could explain. Even people born blind have reported seeing during their experiences, something that defies all logic of traditional science. In India, Japan, Africa, or Brazil, the stories repeat with astonishingly similar details. Even among young children, who haven't yet been influenced by cultural or religious ideas, there are descriptions of lights, spiritual guides, encounters with familiar figures, and sensations of peace that contrast starkly with the clinical desperation of the moment. This universal pattern suggests that we may be facing something far deeper than a simple chemical hallucination. But why then aren't these accounts considered irrefutable proof of life after death? Because modern science requires reproducibility, control, and measurement, elements that are difficult to apply to such subjective and intimate experiences. In these cases, consciousness escapes our instruments. It leaves no physical traces. It leaves memories, emotions, and profound transformations in those who return. And here lies another fascinating point: the transformative impact of NDEs. People who come back from that threshold often report radical life changes. Fears dissolve, attachments vanish, love, compassion, and the search for meaning become central. It is not uncommon for them to abandon careers, completely change their lifestyles, or devote themselves to humanitarian causes. Something, during that time outside of time, reconnected with a greater truth. In the end, perhaps NDEs are not merely phenomena. Perhaps they are messages, fragmented memories of something we forgot at birth, or glimpses of something we'll return to after death. Perhaps consciousness in those moments is whispering that life is more than flesh, bones, and electric impulses, that there is something beyond, a place, a vibration, a state of being we have yet to name, but that has already been felt by those who, for one brief instant, touched the other side. Since ancient times, when humanity still walked by torchlight and gathered around fires in sacred rituals, death has been a subject of reverence, fear, and faith. Long before neurological exams, scalpels, or digital charts, our ancestors viewed the final breath not as an end, but as a passage. The body would fall, yet something remained, an invisible thread that could not be touched but continued on, like a flame that doesn't extinguish, only moves. Across every corner of the world, this spark was given many names: soul, spirit, essence, breath. But the question remained the same: what happens to it after the body dies? In Christianity, consciousness is intimately connected to the immortal soul. When the body dies, the soul lives on, awaiting Judgment Day. Heaven and hell are not mere metaphors. They are spiritual destinies reflecting the choices made in life. Those who lived with faith, repentance, and love are guided toward eternal light with God. Those who strayed from that light wander through valleys of darkness and anguish, where fire consumes not the body, but the soul. Between these extremes lies purgatory, a realm of purification, where the soul suffers, learns, and prepares for ultimate peace. Spiritism, based on the works of Allan Kardec, offers one of the most detailed visions of consciousness after death. In this belief system, the soul not only survives, it continues to learn, evolve, and interact. There are spiritual planes, astral colonies, and a complex network of reincarnations where each life is a chapter of growth. Mediums serve as bridges between the two worlds, sensing thoughts, feelings, and messages from disembodied spirits. Death, therefore, is not an end, but an interval between journeys. The consciousness crosses the veil, carrying memories, traumas, and loves, and returns, when ready, in another body, in another time, to begin again. In Buddhism, death is seen as part of an eternal cycle. Samsara. Consciousness does not die, it transforms. It reincarnates into other bodies, other forms, always seeking enlightenment. Every action generates our karma, a consequence that shapes future existences. The ultimate goal is not to live forever, but to escape the cycle, to reach nirvana, the state in which consciousness merges with the whole, dissolving the individual self. In this process, consciousness is not a fixed entity, but a continuous flow of perception, sensation, and experience, changing moment by moment, like a river that is never the same. In Hinduism, this concept expands. The Atman Haas, the true self, is eternal and indestructible. When the body dies, consciousness may be reborn as another human, an animal, or even a divine form. Everything depends on dharma, the fulfillment of spiritual duty, and accumulated karma. The soul travels through realms of existence, and through deep meditation, it is said one can access memories of past lives. Some yogis claim to consciously choose their next incarnation, guiding their awareness toward a chosen path of continuation. Islam also views the soul as a living entity beyond death. When the body ceases, the soul enters a state called barzakh, a barrier between this life and the next, where it awaits the day of judgment. During this period, a person's deeds are weighed, intentions examined. At the end of time, all will be resurrected and judged by God. Paradise is described as a garden of eternal delights, where the soul finds peace. Hell, on the other hand, is a place not of physical suffering, but of spiritual anguish, where the pain is felt by the soul that has strayed from the divine. In shamanic, indigenous, and African traditions, consciousness after death is seen as a return to nature. The spirit of the deceased joins the ancestors, the forests, the rivers, the stars. There is no separation between the spiritual and the physical world. Everything is interconnected. Spirits may visit descendants, guide, protect, or even intervene. Funerary rituals are not farewells, but celebrations of passage. Consciousness is not personal property. It is part of the collective spirit, the ancient wisdom that accumulates and renews with each generation. Despite the cultural differences, there is an invisible thread connecting all these beliefs. The idea that consciousness does not die. It moves, shifts form, resurfaces, returns, dissolves, ascends. And each tradition, in its own way, prepares the living for that moment. Rites of passage, prayers, vigils, chants, All are, at their core, attempts to guide consciousness through the unknown, from darkness to the other side of light. In the end, perhaps all these traditions are speaking of the same thing, using different languages, metaphors, and symbols. Perhaps they are all trying to unravel the same mystery. What happens to what we feel we are, when everything we are ceases to be? And what if each of them holds a fragment of the truth, a piece of the vast puzzle that is consciousness beyond death? In an age where science advances rapidly through the secrets of matter, genetics, and the universe, one might expect that consciousness would already be fully explained, but quite the opposite. It remains one of the greatest mysteries of existence. And when the question turns to what happens to it after death, modern theories arise that defy logic, blur the lines between science and spirituality, and propose answers that sound like science fiction, yet are serious speculations offered by physicists, neuroscientists, and philosophers of mind. Here, we enter a realm where reason meets mystery, and consciousness may not be something that ends, but something that transforms. One of the most intriguing ideas is the so-called receiver brain theory. According to this hypothesis, the human brain does not create consciousness. It receives it, like a radio that picks up an invisible frequency and translates it into sound. When the device breaks, the signal does not vanish. It simply cannot be decoded anymore. In the same way, consciousness would be a kind of universal, eternal field that only manifests through biological structures. When we die, this field doesn't disappear. It simply detaches from the physical body and continues in another form, in another plane of existence. This vision is supported by scientists like Larry Dossey and Rupert Sheldrake, who explore the mind as something non-local, not confined to the brain. Another bold theory comes from quantum physics. The physicist Roger Penrose, in collaboration with anesthesiologist and Stuart Hameroff, developed a theory called ORCH-OR, Orchestrated Objective Reduction, suggesting that consciousness arises from quantum processes within the microtubules of brain cells. These processes, they propose, are linked to a fundamental network of information woven into the fabric of the universe. When the body dies, that information isn't lost. It reintegrates into the cosmos. In other words, consciousness is like a program that, once unplugged from its hardware, returns to pure code, stored within a cosmic quantum cloud. And what if reality, as we know it, is just a simulation? The simulation hypothesis, supported by thinkers like Nick Bostrom, proposes that we are living in a computational reality created by a superior intelligence or an advanced civilization. If this is true, then death may be equivalent to the shutdown of an avatar, but not of the player. The true consciousness would reside on another plane, observing, learning, evolving. When we die, we might simply log out of the game, returning to our original self, whatever that may be. The multiverse theory also proposes an unusual scenario. According to it, every choice we make spawns a new branch of reality. Thus, when we die in one universe, we might continue in another, in a parallel timeline where the outcome was different. At a deeper level, consciousness could potentially shift between these realities, never entirely vanishing, but relocating. Death, in this framework, would be a transition between different versions of the self across dimensions. And then there's a theory, though extremely speculative, that echoes many ancient traditions, that information is the foundation of all things. According to some physicists, like John Wheeler, the universe is not made of matter, but of bits of information, the famous it from bit. If consciousness is a form of complex information, then it could be stored, processed, perhaps even reassembled. Death, in this case, would be a disconnection from the physical system, but not necessarily the end of the conscious data. The mind, reduced to informational patterns, might persist in another layer of reality. In the realm of synthetic biology, researchers are already discussing the possibility of downloading consciousness, or something like it, into non-biological systems. While we are far from achieving this, the idea of mind uploading is no longer pure fiction. If someday it becomes possible to transfer the entirety of a person's thoughts, memories, and identity patterns into a digital system, where does consciousness end? And if one could live digitally after biological death, would that be survival or merely imitation. The holographic universe theory also adds an intriguing idea. According to this perspective, what we call reality is a three-dimensional projection of information encoded on a two-dimensional boundary, like a hologram. Consciousness, then, might exist outside of space and time, merely being projected here temporarily. Death would be the collapse of that projection, and our true identity would exist beyond the reach of our senses. Amid so many theories, one truth stands tall. No one knows for sure. But all these ideas, though distinct, seem to converge in one direction, that consciousness may not end with death. It may change state, change form, change dimensions. Perhaps what we call the end is merely a transition point, a threshold, a new beginning. And if that's the case, then death is not an abyss. It is a mirror, a reflection of the mystery of living. And when we pass through that mirror, we may not be received by emptiness, but by the very consciousness that always inhabited us, now free from the body, free from time, free from name, simply being. There are stories that, even when whispered, echo loudly within us. Stories that don't fit into scientific manuals, that slip through the cracks of what is known, challenging everything we think we understand about life, the mind, and what lies beyond. They emerge like whispers from the margins of academic research, in the testimonies of doctors who change their beliefs, in the vivid memories of children who should not remember, but do. These extraordinary accounts and curious studies, though dismissed by many, continue to ask us the same haunting question: does consciousness truly die? In the mid-20th century, a psychiatrist from the University of Virginia named Ian Stevenson began documenting accounts of young children who claimed to have lived previous lives. With a skeptical mind, Stevenson traveled to more than 20 countries, collecting over 2,500 cases. Children aged 3, 4, 5, who knew names, dates, places, intimate details about deceased individuals, people who had often lived in faraway villages unknown to the child's current family. In some instances, these children bore birthmarks exactly where the deceased had suffered fatal injuries. Coincidence? It's impossible to say. But the consistency and precision of these reports impressed even the staunchest skeptics. Cases like that of James Leininger in the United States also drew global attention. From a very young age, James began having vivid nightmares of burning planes, pilot names, World War II battleships. His initially doubtful parents began to investigate and discovered that every detail matched the life and death of an American pilot named James Houston Jr., killed in the Pacific in 1945. James, the boy, had never been exposed to this information, and even as he grew older, he never denied the strange connection he felt to that previous life. In hospitals, clinics, and deathbeds, other accounts defy logic. There are patients who, in deep comas or under declared brain death, return to life with clear memories of events that occurred during their supposed unconsciousness. They describe medical conversations, instruments used, decisions made, all while, from a clinical perspective, there was no consciousness at all. In a well-known case, a patient undergoing a highly delicate surgery, with continuous brain monitoring and extreme hypothermia, later described observing the entire procedure from above, hearing every word the surgical team said. What she reported was confirmed point by point. And it's not just patients. Doctors, surgeons, nurses, professionals who live at the border between life and death have reported experiences that completely change their understanding of the end. Some, after witnessing inexplicable events, abandoned their skepticism and began seriously studying the phenomenon. Dr. Eben Alexander, a renowned neurosurgeon, is one such example. After spending 7 days in a deep coma caused by bacterial meningitis with virtually no brain function, Alexander had a powerful experience, which he described as a journey through spiritual realms, guided by a presence he could not explain. Upon his return, he wrote the book Proof of Heaven, where he details his experience and affirms with conviction, consciousness survives the death of the brain. In the field of parapsychology, other studies suggest that the mind may exist independently of the body. Research on telepathy, clairvoyance, extrasensory perception, and even mediumistic communication reveals patterns that, while not definitive proof of life after death, point toward a non-local dimension of consciousness. In controlled experiments, some individuals have been able to describe hidden images, distant sounds, or other people's thoughts with accuracy beyond chance. These are subtle, hard-to-replicate phenomena, but they challenge the materialist view of the mind. Then there are spontaneous accounts, which don't fit in a lab, but persist in the real world. People who dream of loved ones at the exact moment of their death, even from miles away. Children who talk to invisible friends, later identified as deceased relatives. Sounds, touches, scents, subtle signs of a presence that refuses to vanish. Some find comfort in these moments. Others see coincidence. But there are also those who believe they are signs of something greater, something that science has yet to measure. It's important to acknowledge that many of these stories resist objective verification, but at the same time they cannot be easily dismissed. Because behind each story is a person, a lived experience, a real transformation. Even when there is no physical evidence, there are deep emotional marks, radical life changes, and a renewed perspective on what it means to be alive, and what it means to stop being. Perhaps we will never be able to measure consciousness with precision. Perhaps it lies beyond any instrument. But when we listen to these stories, one silent question arises. What if it's true? What if consciousness, so fragile and so powerful, doesn't fade away, but simply changes frequency? And what if the veil between worlds is thinner than we think, more permeable than we dare to imagine? There is a moment, brief and silent, when the eyes close and the world transforms. The body rests, but the mind awakens. It floats, dissolves, creates impossible landscapes, relives forgotten memories, meets people who have long departed, visits places it has never seen. That moment is the dream, a bridge between the known and the unexplained. And as we study what happens to consciousness during sleep, we are confronted with a strange and fascinating mirror of what may occur after death. For many Eastern philosophers, such as the sages of Hinduism and Tibetan Buddhism, the dream state is a simulation of the transitional phase between lives. The bardo, as it is called in Buddhism, is an intermediate state in which consciousness has already left the body, but has not yet been reborn. In that interval, dreamlike visions arise as projections of one's karma, accumulated desires, fears, and emotions. Curiously, this description closely resembles modern reports of near-death experiences, in which reality appears fluid, symbolic, and malleable, like a lucid dream stretching beyond time. Then enters a molecule, present in the human body and many plant species, capable of projecting consciousness into similar realms. That molecule is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. Produced naturally by the pineal gland, according to some hypotheses, DMT is known as the spirit molecule. When administered in controlled settings, it transports individuals into profound states of altered consciousness, visual, sensory, and emotional realities so intense that many report feeling out of body, passing through portals, encountering entities, and receiving messages about life and death. Some scientists speculate that large amounts of DMT are released naturally at birth, and again in the moments just before death. If this is true, then perhaps the moment of final transition is, in essence, a deep plunge into an ocean of inner symbols, memories, and meanings. A final dream, vivid and eternal, in which consciousness reconnects with something far greater. There are those who, after ayahuasca ceremonies, the Amazonian brew rich in DMT, describe encounters with deceased loved ones, visions of other planes, and a sense of total unity with the universe. But altered states are not limited to substances. Techniques such as deep meditation, holotropic breathing, sensory deprivation, and even prolonged tribal dances can trigger similar phenomena. Tibetan monks, for example, describe stages of identity dissolution during advanced meditation. They speak of pure light perception, timelessness, and an overwhelming sense of oneness with everything. During these practices, consciousness appears to expand beyond the body, reaching what they call the clear light of the mind, a state close to enlightenment or to death. And what if consciousness, in these states, is rehearsing its own release? What if the brain, approaching death, spontaneously enters these modes of perception, like a program running its final script. It is at this crossroads that dreams, DMT, and altered states become even more mysterious. They do not merely imitate death, perhaps at some level, they anticipate it. Neuroscientist Rick Strassman, who studied the effects of DMT on volunteers, observed something fascinating. Many accounts included visions of beings, sensations of coming home, and contact with a loving and intelligent presence. For some, the experience was so profound that it changed the course of their lives. Strassman began to question whether DMT was not just an internal hallucinogen, but a chemical key, one that unlocks portals to other levels of reality. But is it possible to distinguish what is merely brain activity from what may truly be another dimension of consciousness? That question remains unanswered. Perhaps our very concept of reality needs to be redefined. Perhaps what we call real is only a narrow band of perception, and everything beyond, dreams, visions, trances, are glimpses of something greater, hidden just behind the curtain of waking life. When we dream, we rarely doubt the reality of that dream. Only upon awakening do we realize it was a dream. And what if death is that awakening? What if life, as solid and tangible as it seems, is only one of many states of consciousness? A temporary stage, intense but fleeting, like the brief moment when we close our eyes and open the doors to the infinite. No matter how far we advance, no matter how much data we collect, charts we draw, or theories we build, something always escapes. A blind spot, a shadow untouched by the light of reason. Consciousness, this silent presence that inhabits us, remains the most intimate and, at the same time, the most inexplicable of human experiences. And it is precisely within this territory of uncertainty that science and philosophy, instead of opposing forces, seem to reach out to one another. Both seek to answer the same question: what are we, when everything we have ceases to be? In science, the dominant paradigm is physical materialism. According to this view, consciousness is a product of the brain, nothing more than the result of electrochemical processes, an illusion generated by highly sophisticated neural networks. When the brain dies, all ends. But there is a fundamental flaw in this approach. It does not explain why we feel what we feel. It describes how things work, but not why. You can trace a firing neuron, but where is fear, love, longing? Where exactly is the experience? No matter how much data we gather, subjective experience, the so-called qualia, remains invisible. This is why philosopher David Chalmers proposed what he called the hard problem of consciousness. He argues that even if we understand all the brain's mechanisms, we will still not understand why certain experiences have flavor, color, emotional texture. Why does seeing the color red create a particular sensation? Why does a childhood memory bring a tear to the eye? Why do we feel sorrow or ecstasy? No synapse fully explains this. Other philosophers like Thomas Nagel suggest that consciousness is irreducible. In his famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, Nagel questions whether we can ever truly understand the subjective perspective of another living being. If we cannot even know what it's like to be a bat, how can we assert with certainty what happens to human consciousness after death? On the other hand, philosophical idealism, the opposite current to materialism, presents a bold vision. Consciousness is not created by matter, but rather the opposite. Matter is an expression of consciousness. This idea was championed by great thinkers such as Berkeley, Schopenhauer, and even Carl Jung, who viewed reality as a symbol of the deep psyche. According to this perspective, the entire universe is, in fact, a projection of the mind, and death, a return to the source. Modern neuroscience has also begun to show cracks in the classical paradigm. Research with patients who've had out-of-body experiences, advanced meditators, users of psychedelic substances, and even individuals in vegetative states have shown that consciousness can persist or emerge in situations where the brain should be inactive. Science is beginning to cautiously consider that the mind may be more than a biological byproduct. Perhaps it is a field, a fundamental property of the universe, like space, time, or gravity. Theorists such as Bernardo Kastrup, Amit Goswami, and others advocating for non-local consciousness, suggest that the universe is, at its core, mental. Matter, the body, the brain, all of these are temporary interfaces used by consciousness to experience itself. Death, then, would be the closing of a window, but not the end of the light. Just as a browser tab may close, the internet continues to exist. The individual self dissolves, but what we truly are, this nameless consciousness, remains. And there lies perhaps the deepest irony of all. Science and philosophy, in trying to explain the death of consciousness, may be revealing that consciousness is the only fixed point. Everything else changes, decays, disappears. But this I, this inner perception, might be eternal, untouchable, invisible, immeasurable. But if that's true, then why are we so afraid to die? Perhaps because we confuse consciousness with identity, with our story, our body, our name. But what if death doesn't erase consciousness, but the ego? What if what dies is only the character, not the stage? In the end, as science and philosophy approach death, both seem to bow before the same altar, the altar of mystery. And perhaps that is where the answer resides, not in absolute certainty, but in humble reverence for what we have yet to understand. Because sometimes we don't need to understand everything to feel that something greater exists. Death, that word whispered in corners of the world, stirring fear, reverence, and silence. It doesn't matter where we're born, what language we speak, or which gods we worship. All of us one day will have to meet it. And yet, it remains the greatest taboo, the deepest mystery, the ultimate mirror of existence. But what if, just for a moment, we stopped seeing it as an enemy and looked at it as a teacher? What might death have to teach us? Not about the end, but about the meaning of being alive. Death reminds us that time is precious, that each breath is a miracle that won't repeat itself, that every person we cross paths with may be an unrepeatable universe, and that the now, this very now, in which you breathe, listen, feel, is the only truly real moment. Knowing that we are going to die is not a burden, it's a call to live with more presence, more truth, more intensity, to let go of distractions, of small fears, of empty vanities, and to connect with what truly matters. Throughout history, the Stoics repeated a powerful phrase, memento mori, remember you will die, but not as a threat, as liberation, as a key that unlocks the door to authenticity. Because only when we remember that everything fades, do we begin to value what remains, the affections, the choices, the marks we leave on others. In that sense, death is not the end of the road. It is the rear-view mirror that helps us drive with greater awareness. There is something curious about consciousness in the face of death. It transforms. Many people who have endured deep losses report that they began to live differently. Death took someone away, but left a new perspective, a new way of feeling the world. As if, by touching absence, they had also touched a deeper dimension of life. As if, in losing, they had recovered something essential. When we reflect on death, we ask, what, after all, remains? The body leaves. The voice goes silent. The story ends. But consciousness may find another rhythm, another shape, another frequency. Perhaps it survives as memory, as legacy, as seed. Or maybe it simply returns to the source from which it came, like a drop returning to the ocean. And if that's so, then there is no end, only return. Death also reminds us that everything is in motion, that life is impermanence, that nothing is fixed, guaranteed, or still. This may be the hardest truth to accept, and also the most liberating. Because if nothing is permanent, then everything can be lived with more lightness, with more surrender, with more courage. In that flow, consciousness is not a fixed point. It is a river that moves, that crosses landscapes, that changes shape, but is always water in motion. Many sages have said, to die before dying is the key to freedom. That means living with the awareness that everything is fleeting, and for that very reason, sacred. It means letting die what no longer serves us, fears, masks, guilt. It means being reborn each day with new eyes. And perhaps When real death arrives, it will not be a shock, but an embrace. Because in the end, maybe consciousness doesn't fear death. Maybe it only fears forgetting what it truly is. And what if death is not an end, but a moment of remembrance? A remembering that we are not just a body, a name, a story, but an eternal presence, a particle of the infinite, a spark of something that never began, and therefore can never end. And so, at the end of this silent journey, all that remains is the echo of a question that may never fully fade. What happens to consciousness after death? We've explored the roots of science, listened to the whispers of spiritual traditions, walked the corridors of philosophy, and navigated through experiences that challenge the impossible. And even after all this, perhaps the only true answer is silence itself. A silence that does not deny, but welcomes, that does not end, but expands. A silence that gently whispers that perhaps some things were never meant to be explained, only felt. Because death, for all its apparent finality, may not be the opposite of life. Perhaps it is merely the opposite of birth. And between these 2 points, what truly lives is consciousness. Fluid, mysterious, unbreakable. A flame that may change form but never ceases to shine. And if consciousness is eternal, if it is the foundation of everything, then death is not an end. It is a curve, a transition, a passage through a portal that to the eyes of reason seems dark, but to the soul carries an ancient light, familiar. Maybe we are like dewdrops resting on a leaf for just a moment, reflecting the sky, the wind, the sun, before returning to the vast ocean from which we came. And in this brief moment called life, consciousness observes, feels, loves, learns, suffers, transcends. And when the body lies down one last time, perhaps it merely closes the eyes of the physical world to open the eyes of a greater one. A world without time, without space, without name. And even if all of this is only a hypothesis, still, there is beauty in the doubt. For it is in uncertainty that wonder blossoms. It is because we don't know what lies beyond that every gesture of love becomes more sacred, every gaze more profound, every encounter more unique. If we knew the answer with certainty, we might lose the magic of seeking, of imagining, of feeling. Life is so precious because it is finite, but perhaps, just perhaps, what we truly are never had a beginning, and therefore can never end. In the end, maybe the most important question is not what happens after death, but how we are living before it. What kind of consciousness are we cultivating? What marks are we leaving behind? What memories are we building? Because if consciousness continues, then everything we are, feel, and do continues too. And if it doesn't, even then, it is worth living fully. Because living with presence is, in itself, a miracle. A rare gift from the universe, pulsing for only a moment, yet echoing into eternity. Close your eyes, breathe, feel, you are here. And that is already a mystery far too deep to ever fit into any answer.